My name, as mentioned, is Jerry Hope. Thank you for mentioning my Clinton name, Chuck Cake. I'm Sick Cuddy from Wrangell. Come from the Red Clay House. And as mentioned, we claim the wolf, eagle, moiety, and we claim the brown bear and killer whale crests. In 2000, 2001, it had occurred to me that when Alaska Day was being celebrated here in Sitka, and it's always a big deal here in Sitka, and if you haven't been here in Sitka for Alaska Day, you'll notice that there's parades, there's people wearing period costumes. As you probably lay witness to those people who greeted you at the airport, they didn't seem to have the current day standard dresses. But it occurred to me that there had been a lot of discussion within the Native community about pain, about confrontation, about we were not considered or asked or part of the dialogue when it came time to this treaty session that occurred. And so there, in the parades, some people thought, why am I even trying to watch a parade, or what am I supposed to be celebrating here? And so I asked the Camp Number 1 officers and members if we wanted to start a dialogue about what that meaning is. There are current terminologies: historical trauma, intergenerational trauma. And the membership at that time refused to support that concept because they said it might bring up too much stuff and we're not prepared to handle what it might bring up. 17 years ago. I've been working for 17 years to try and bring this discussion to the community. And I'm really glad and feel fortunate that Alice Taft here from Joy and Peter Metcalf, who is on the organizing committee, I think he stepped out for a minute, and Sergey Khan, if you're on the way, please. And people like Bob Sam, who's on the organizing committee, and others who are on the organizing committee supported the idea of finally bringing this to a discussion publicly. It ended up being a little bit of a challenge for me than I thought it would be on trying to find a couple of people who would be able to present, who have researched this, who have studied this, who are both native and non-native, because I wanted to have that kind of balance. And that was Brother Andy's concept about the clan conference, is that we have those who are non-native who study us, and those who are native who study and are professionals in their own right, whether it's by Western scholarship and doctorate degrees or by our own cultural scholarly knowledge, without the Western paper that goes with it. And we're very, very fortunate of the Clan Conference to find Mary Annette Pember. Would you please come forward? And Jeremy Braithwaite. Would you please come forward? Who will do the presenting next? I do want to say that it was kind of interesting. First, I approached them individually, and I don't think they knew each other to begin with. But due to their professional grasp, their knowledge, their skills, and just their natural personalities, it seemed like they were able to blend in with each other and put together a program and a presentation. And I know that Jeremy has a PowerPoint that he's going to share with you, and I believe Mary Annette will be speaking with you without a PowerPoint. Please welcome Mary Annette Pember.
Ani Nishiwa, Baba Manapad, Condition Palace, Mom, and Dudam, Nindu Shiva, Mashkiki Zibi, Chin Nuguch, Ninwizon. And I said, hello, relatives. My Ojibwe name is Baba Manapad, and my clan is the Umi clan, and I'm from Medicine River Reservation. Non-Indians are named it Bad River, and I thank you for letting us. I thank you for inviting me to your beautiful community. If I make any mistakes or offend anyone, I ask you and elders here to forgive me. And I did also want to let people know before I begin that some of my words today might trigger difficult memories for some folks, and I was requested to note that there are two wonderful ladies here who are counselors, Vicki and Louise. I assume they thought everybody would know them, but they will be available to visit with folks if they need to, and they said they would give out their phone numbers, and if you found something at some later point that you wanted to visit, I'm going to visit with them because I try to avail myself of that. I try to take care of myself when I do this work. The work is really has been about taking care of myself. So for Ojibwe women, it's all about story. And although I'm a journalist, I have to begin the way I was taught so long ago by my mother, Anishinaabe, one of the great storytellers. The story of historical trauma and Native peoples begs to be framed in a narrative, like one of my mother's teaching stories with the suffering embedded in allegory. Any other beginning would be too much to bear. It happened, you see, exactly as she had described it to me. First as a real-life, terrible fairy tale told to me over and over in my childhood, and then as part of her personal history, as she tried to work through and make sense of the senseless doings at the Indian Catholic boarding school, the sister school, and the irrational actions of the nuns who held absolute power over the lives of the Ojibwe children. Chief among them was Mother Superior Sister Catherine, who became the boogeyman of my childhood, a monster who exercised her authority over my mother and her peers, often beating and shaming them with a delusional zeal as though she believed she was the very right hand of God. My mother would often tell me of one glorious day at the sister school, the day Mother Superior, Sister Catherine died after falling down the kitchen steps. Maybe it was terrible, but what a silent cheer us kids made when, in that Christmas season, she would say, clasping her hands together in delight, savoring Mother Superior's delicious comeuppance. Maybe it was terrible, but we did a silent cheer. It was the best Christmas present we could have had, she said. As I entered adulthood, I assumed the story was a child's fantasy, and surely the tale of its juicy moral reward couldn't be true. But then, as part of my research about the impact of Indian boarding schools, I visited the library at the Jesuit University in Marquette, Milwaukee, where all the Catholic Indian boarding school records are stored. I had hoped to find records relating to my mother's years at the St. Mary's boarding school in Wisconsin. Instead, I found only her name listed in the roster of students. I was disappointed by the lack of personal records. I recall now, as I sat alone in the vast library, I grew weary of leafing through the yellowed stack of administrative papers. Reading them was slow going since I was required to wear archivist gloves. I paused and wondered if I should call it a day. I wondered, why was it so cold in here? The icy room was silent except for the occasional muffled sound of footsteps from other rooms in the vast building. Aside from the receptionist, I was the only person in the reading room, yet I distinctly heard someone whisper my name sharply, Mary. I looked at the receptionist, and she was placidly gazing at her computer terminal. The whisper brought me up short. It sounded disconcertingly like my mother's voice. There was a distinct note of warning that reminded me vividly of my childhood. She would say my name sharply if I grew careless in doing my chores, scrubbing the floor on my hands and knees. Get on your prayer bones, girl, she would say. Ignoring her warning usually meant a slap on the rear end. Even as an adult, her voice could touch an involuntary part of my mind. In the quiet there, I drifted back to those days, with her alone in the house, with her and her migraines, as powerful and mysterious as the wind and the rain, that pain that held me prisoner. I'm about 4 years old, and I sit next to my wiener dog, Hansi, on the kitchen floor and try to think of what to do. Above all, I have to be quiet. It's summer and the air is torpid and hot. Our little house, however, is dark and cool, shaded by elms, ringed with gardens of shade-loving lilies of the valley, her flower. Hansi's long black toenails click as he walks across the floor. Be quiet, I mean. Mama doesn't feel good, I hiss at him. He sits down again, his brows knit in embarrassment. He keeps watch of me. Carefully, I find my stool, I use it to reach the kitchen countertop. I make her toast, and I find the bottle of Anacin and fill a glass with water. I'm very careful. I bring it all into her dark bedroom without spilling anything. I place my offerings on the little table next to her bed. Silently, I climb up on the back of the sofa and gather up all her glass and porcelain figurines and retreat deep into the forest of wooden legs under the dining room table. This is my place. It offers good protection when grown-ups are drunk. Drunk is something they do. We're all powerless against it. They forget about me here under the table where I draw secret messages on the underside of the table with my black crayon. I press hard when they begin to weep and fight. Now I carefully line up her precious figurines, the elf, the Santa, the girl in the pink hoop skirt, and the dear mother with her twin fawns forever attached to her throat by a golden chain. The twin fawns are badly chipped from banging into each other as they play and tug at the chain. The dear mother's face is expressionless. She tells him, Gaween, stop. I whisper detailed instructions to the figurines. My furtive little girl's ceremony works as medicine because after a while my mother calls to me, Mary. I find her lying in the dark on the white nubby cotton bedspread with one arm thrown over her eyes. The other arm is open for me. Silently I climb onto the bed, fitting myself into her armpit and gaze into the cleft of her breasts where the tiny blue Virgin Mary medal lives, pinned to her brassiere. The bedspread is stiff from its time drying outside in the clothesline, but smells of fresh air and her. She spends hours washing the laundry, white to white, like the sisters taught her, rushing up and down the cellar steps with baskets of those heavy white wet sheets. We may be Indian, but by God, we ain't dirty, she says, while hanging sheets on the line, even in winter's coldest days. Her deep voice wraps a cocoon around us in the dark bedroom. I'm thrilled with her attention at last. Her words are only for me. Emerging from my reverie, I realized I was being directed by her here in the Jesuits' library. There was something here that required my attention. And so there I found it. There in the boxes and boxes of ledgers and dusty administrative correspondence was the real story. It was far more personal than I dared to hope. I found a yellow, typewritten letter dated January 3rd, 1934. It was addressed to the Right Reverend Monsignor William Hughes, Director of the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions in Washington, D.C., from Sister Mary Macaria of St. Mary's Indian School in Odena, Wisconsin. In part, it read, by the time these lines reach you, our dear Mother Superior, Sister Catherine, will no doubt have been called to her eternal reward. On December 19th, she fell off the second last step leading down to the kitchen entry. She must have pitched forward with great force, for in striking her head against a windowsill, a gash was cut in her forehead by the temple of her glasses. It seemed for a time they thought she was recovering, and then the letter continues. On Friday, December 29th, the sister nurse noticed a change in sister's condition and told us she feared a stroke. Our dear sister had convulsions, was anointed, and has been speechless since. The doctor says it can hardly be but a matter of a day or so. Most if she does linger even that long. We know you will pray earnestly for her eternal repose and for a speedy relief from her sufferings. Sorrowfully yours in the agonizing heart of Jesus. Signed, Sister Macaria. I sat open-mouthed for some time in the silent library. The revelatory moment in which I held the letter of Sister Catherine's death in my hand has gone a long way in my continued understanding of the impact of trauma on my mother and my family's lives, and on me. Here at last was proof of the sister school stories of my childhood, of the crucible that formed the tightened little fist that was my mother. The letter's discovery is an allegory for the power of validation, as well as the intimate nature of recovery from trauma. Recovery is personal and has to emerge on our own terms. In my work about the impact of historical trauma and unresolved grief on the lives of Native peoples and ways they are healing from the trauma and building resiliency, I've written explanatory articles about the science of trauma, its impact on our growing minds, bodies, as well as our genes. One of my resources, I was wondering if someone could give me a little water. I'm feeling a little. Thank you. Michelle Sotero at the University of Nevada offered a threefold definition of historical trauma. In the initial phase, the dominant culture perpetrates mass trauma on a population in the form of colonization, colonialism, slavery, war, and genocide. In the second phase, the affected population shows physical and psychological symptoms in response to the trauma. In the final phase, the initial population passes these responses to trauma to subsequent generations, who in turn display similar symptoms. For me, the definition, although clinically accurate, fails to fully describe the long generational train wreck that Native peoples experienced as a result of years of misguided federal policies. The impact of these policies, such as forced attendance at Indian boarding schools, has been catastrophic, robbing us of our language, culture, traditions, and even our children. As a result, we are often depicted in mainstream America as the gold standards for intractable social dysfunction and bad health. Indeed, much of our dis-ease has proved remarkably resistant to even the best intentioned Western methods of mental health care interventions. This is no mystery in the failure of these efforts, at least not for Native peoples. How could such a destructive force offer true healing and restoration? Genuine healing emerges from within, from a place of choice and power. In 2014 to 15, I received support for this work from the Annenberg School of Communications and Journalism, University of Southern California, the Dennis A. Hunt Fund for Health Journalism, and also received support from the Rosalind Carter Fellowship for Health Journalism, Mental Health Journalism for the work. The combined financial support allowed me to travel and spend quality time pursuing this important issue. During my fellowship year, I wrote 14 stories in total, in which I researched and described the physical and mental impact of trauma, the high rates of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences among Native peoples, and the likelihood that epigenetics may play a role in explaining our high rates of disease. I traveled to Ottawa for the closing events of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, part of Canada's Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement with the Aboriginal peoples there, and reported on the 5-year mandate that included long-term support for mental health services and traditional forms of healing. I also wrote about efforts here in the U.S. about boarding school survivors, efforts to gain government support for healing and mental health care interventions. In my research, I read stacks of dense research reports talking to numerous Native and non-Native healthcare professionals and grassroots community members. I quickly identified a common thread running through the research. The most important element of successfully addressing the historical trauma that underlies mental health disparities in Indian country is valuing and supporting grassroots, spirituality, and culturally based interventions. The main stumbling block, however, thank you.
No.
It's going to take a quick break. The main stumbling block, however, these kinds of interventions is the disconnect between the Native worldview and that of Western science-based perspectives on effective mental health programs. In the Lakota worldview, for instance, incorporating healing of the spirit is essentially healing the mind and the body. People are spiritual beings. We Lakota don't question that. Cindy Gallego, program manager of the Healing Center in Porcupine, South Dakota on the Pine Ridge Reservation, told me, federal funding agencies want proof that our interventions work in the form of science and logic. But how do you measure spirituality? Holly Echohawk, a member of the First Nations Behavioral Health Association, pointed out, empirically based science leaves no room for the cultural context that is crucial to the success of the treatment approach within tribal communities. Joe Gahn, professor of psychology at the University of Michigan, also of the First Nations Behavioral Association, noted that Western biomedical mental health interventions focus on the absence of disease and imply mind-body separation in treating illness. Cultural interventions, on the other hand, measure wellness as a harmonious relationship within the whole person, including mind, body, emotion, and spirit. Native researchers like Echohawk and Gahn are working to build bridges between these worldviews. Echohawk coined the phrase practice-based evidence, or reversal of scientifically accepted measure evidence-based practice, to describe the success of Native culturally based interventions on Native terms. In other words, the community, rather than an outside evaluator, determines how well an intervention works. Echohawk and other Native mental health professionals and researchers are part of a movement to create a new framework for evaluating and guiding Native-based Native design interventions. They call it the cultural competence movement. This movement, according to Echo Hawk, is driven by experiences in the field versus the science-driven evaluation philosophy of academia. So I witnessed search of successful interventions and culturally competent examples of these interventions in the field, and to give some legs to the story, as we say in the business. So since Indian country is very diverse, there are over 500 federally recognized tribes in the U.S., my Native healthcare sources emphasize that really effective programs need to be tribal specific. There's no one-size-fits-all for Native peoples. So I was able to spend time in Alaska's Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta with folks from Chalawar-Charak Healthy Living Program, a tribal program that is a sort of Yupik-specific rapid response trauma team. The Yupik are a truly unique group of folks who occupy over 50 remote isolated villages on the tundra that lead to the Bering Sea. They represent a keen example of the distinctive quality and diversity of tribal communities. Because of their inaccessible locations, the Yupik are relatively unaffected by were relatively unaffected by Western contact until the beginning of the 20th century. Disease, including measles, tuberculosis, and the 1918 flu epidemic, which they called the Great Death, devastated the Yupik. Entire villages were wiped out. Thousands of Alaskan Native children who survived the initial onslaught of disease were orphaned. Out of necessity, missionary groups and the federal government began establishing orphanages for these people. In many ways, the Great Death jump-started boarding schools in Alaska, said Jim Lavelle, a Nupiaq, retired professor of Native American Studies at the University of Alaska Anchorage. The impact of historical trauma is especially fresh for the Yupik. For the past 50 years or more, horrific levels of suicide, violence, sexual violence, and substance abuse have plagued these tiny villages. Mark Anurak, tribal behavioral health consultant, noted that many mental health approaches have been used over the years in the region to address the cycle of trauma. The Western interventions were very expensive. Mental health professionals logged hours and hours in their efforts to help the communities to no avail. All the programs, clinics, and interventions simply didn't work. People just kept getting sicker. The best efforts of such Western-based mental health intervention models didn't work for a simple reason. According to Anorak, people in the villages didn't embrace them. Chalawar-Charak, however, is different. Although we don't yet have any precise data, Chalawar-Charak is by far the most requested behavioral health service that YKHC, Yukon-Kuskokwim Healthcare, has ever offered, Anorak reported. Rose Dominic, coordinator of Chalawar-Charak, told me something I've heard many times from elders from both my tribe and others about the power of Native culture and traditions. We have our own resource experts. We have it within us to transform ourselves and our communities into healthy, thriving places. We can do this by reinforcing what we already know as Native people. Rose and her team invited me along to see them in action during an intervention at one of the villages where a 19-year-old girl stabbed and killed her uncle, also 19. The murder was a senseless crime committed during a now-forgotten argument fueled by alcohol and maybe drugs that escalated into blind rage. These young folks had grown up together, and niece often staying at the uncle's family home. Both families were devastated. We entered the victim's home where the wake was in progress. The little house on stilts was full of friends and relatives. The Chalawar-Charak team members comprised of elders as well as mental health care professionals sat down with the family and shared their similar experiences, often crying as they described how the guiding principles of the Yupik traditional ways of healing, Kuyan, I pronounce that correctly, it's been a while, Kuyan, and moreover of Koholian, unconditional love and understanding helped them. One of the elders' words was later translated for me. Our ancestors gave us tools to understand our minds and name our feelings. Our subsistence way of life, the very act of surviving and providing food for our families, is also an important means for healing. We say that true healing can be found on the tundra. Although most of the conversations took place in Yupik, I noticed some tension surrounding the presence of one of the local elders. She seemed to bear this scrutiny with a kind of calm courage that was noteworthy. After meeting with the victim's family, we later visited the perpetrator's home. The scene here was quite different. The perpetrator's father sat alone in the dark, listlessly smoking cigarettes. As the team talked with him, the door opened and in walked that same elder I'd noticed at the victim's home. This was his mother, the grandmother of the perpetrator. The grandmother sat down with her son and the team, and she said to him, "I prepared you. I have taught you our ways that can help you through tough times. I've taught you Koholian. unconditional love and understanding. There is health and wellness in our ways. As he cried bitter tears, she reassured him, it's safe to express your feelings and your pain here. We will not belittle you or talk behind your back. Rose explained to me that her actions demonstrated the real Yupik way. Traditionally, Yupik people openly discuss their feelings, often turning to elders to help sort out difficult situations and problems. A structured system provided guidance for behavior and working out conflict with others. In the unforgiving climate of the tundra, survival depended on cooperation, effective conflict resolution, and maintaining good mental and physical health. Health and healing were found in the everyday actions of subsistence living. By including elders in mental health interventions who speak the language, they are finding the people at Charak that many of them are remembering old Yupik terms and concepts, describing emotional healing that they had forgotten during the boarding school process. In the Cussack white person way, we were taught to stuff our feelings and to isolate ourselves from our Yupik traditions, Rose said. Charak is partially supported by SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration grant that supports quote-unquote promising practices among tribal peoples. In the program evaluations, Charak clients report that the teachings have helped them re-examine their lives using the wisdom of the Yupik elders, and they are feeling better and more whole. The healing process, however, will take time, Dominic noted. Who we came to be today has a lot to do with what happened to us over the last 100 plus years. I will end as I began, this time with another story about my grandma Seal, who was also raised in an Indian boarding school. She was the first generation of my family to be raised in a boarding school. I recently learned the truth about her abandonment of her children. In describing her relationship with Seal, my mother would always say, I never did like my mother, a sentiment she expressed up until her death in 2011. My mother often described the terrible final fight between her parents that preceded their final separation. Pa was a happy-go-lucky drunk. One night he came home drunk and got into a fight with my mother. She hit him over the head with a beer bottle and he sunk down into the ground. I screamed and screamed and screamed. I thought she'd killed him. She would ball up her fists, her hands into little fists, and close her eyes tightly as she told the story, clearly reliving its impact. In visiting relatives, however, I found that my mother's story was a survival fantasy created to keep her mind from shattering into a million pieces. Although the terrible fight between my grandparents happened more than 80 years ago, people still speak of its brutality today. Grandpa Joe was a brutal drunk, a World War I survivor who was in the infantry, and likely was a survivor of PTSD before we had even a name for it. During that last attack on his young bride, he bit off much of one of her breasts. Realizing that my mother, 5 years old at the time, must have witnessed this awful scene, has given me great insight into her behaviors. In order to survive, she identified with my grandpa, the perpetrator, and blamed her mother. I'm awestruck by her strength and determination to wrestle what normalcy she could for herself and her family. I see now that Grandpa Seal had little choice. She saved herself, abandoning her 5 children in the process. Secretly, she would return to the reservation and she would gather medicine for a then unknown illness. In the end, Seal must have thought she could swallow all of those traumas whole, but they lodged in her belly, where they silently poisoned her. She succumbed at last to their hidden power, dying from colon cancer at age 56 before I was born, a disease that we know now is slow-growing and often preventable. Despite the boarding school lessons about the inferiority of her heritage, however, Seal still believed in the mashkiki, after which our reservation is named. Medicine, the traditional Ojibwe medicines, she believed they could heal her. But in the end, the mashkiki alone wasn't enough. But her core belief in the traditional Ojibwe ways speaks volumes about the power and roles of culture, language, and spirituality in the lives of Native peoples. This core belief is a spark of resiliency that has sustained us and offers great promise for the future, and which take a lot of them.
Before I begin, one of the things I wanted to acknowledge real quick is Mary has shared her presentation with me before we met here today. And I read it probably 5 or 6 times. I read it a few weeks ago when she sent it to me. I read it on the plane ride here a couple of times. I came from Los Angeles, so a lot of time between here and Sitka to pass. And I read it again last night, and every time I read it, I found that I was pulling new things out of it and learning new things. Same exact presentation, but always drawing new insights from it. And hearing you talk right now, again, Mary, I realize that I'm still drawing additional insights, so thank you for that. Jerry Hope approached me by phone a few months ago about this conference and said, like he said earlier, that he wanted to bring together Native and non-Native professionals working in this area to speak about this issue of intergenerational historical trauma, and more importantly, what are some ways in which the Native community is healing from some of these issues. And when I attended the warming of the hands ceremony last night, and I'm very glad I did, I realized that there are lots of forms of healing that are already taking shape, that are already taking hold in the Alaska Native communities. And it is my hope that by some small measure today, some of the lessons I bring to share with you will build the momentum of some of that healing. So I ask that you please be patient with me today as I try to leave my Western thinking at the door, as Harold mentioned yesterday. Please also forgive me if I talk too fast. It's a very Western issue that I'm trying to deal with. Since I'm nervous, I tend to talk very, very fast. So please forgive me. Before I begin, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, a little bit about my background. As I mentioned, I came here today from Los Angeles, where I've lived for the past 7 years. I completed my degree in anthropology from the University of California, Irvine, focusing specifically on anthropology of law, which focuses on the ways in which law and legal structures vary from culture to culture. Before that, I was living in Chicago, where I lived for most of my life, so my roots are very, very Midwest. But interestingly enough, I was born in Canada. I was originally born and raised for the first 8 years of my life in the town of Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories. So if you were to kind of plot this out on a map, I kind of did a full circle: Canada, Chicago, Los Angeles, and back here to Alaska, where I've done the majority of my research and work for the past 4 years. So I wanted to begin today by just recapping a number of the issues that Mary and Annette just talked about the many trajectories of historical and intergenerational trauma. I won't belabor these points too heavily right now, but only to say that there are many directions that historical trauma takes a Native person. And as I began this research, I realized that there's not only different forms and functions of historical trauma, but the ways in which Indigenous people describe that trauma is that it pulls them in several different directions, and not realizing if they're coming or going. So we can look at boarding school legacies, assimilation, language loss, land rights, religious imposition, the list goes on and on. These issues of historical and intergenerational trauma are complex. But one of the issues that I've noticed when we discuss historical and intergenerational trauma is that we're often focusing solely on discussions of the United States government and the United States policy as the primary drivers of oppression and marginalization. And this was one of the gaps that I wanted to address, and that led me to the question, what about the academy? I'm sure it's no secret to us that our school books are flawed. The research on Native people is lacking. As Mary Annette mentioned, Indigenous people are often depicted in mainstream America as the gold standards of intractable social dysfunction and health. And this is known as terminal narratives. And as I began looking at the research on Alaska Native people specifically, I noticed that pretty much everything that had been written on the topic focuses on terminal narratives. The death of Native culture, the decline in Native values, the loss of Native language. You start to see a pattern developing here that everything that is written about, discussed, has this terminal end to it. And so it's no surprising that the Native community has reacted to this bounty of research in a very negative way and denouncing 90 to 95% of social scientific studies as worthless, valueless, and without meaning. There's also a long documented history of research abuse against the Alaska Native people and Indigenous people more generally, including the rural Alaska Native population and certainly the Tlingit population here in Sitka and Southeast Alaska. But perhaps most importantly, I find that the research on Alaska Native people is framed in a way that privileges the Western perspective. In other words, issues of ontology, how we address reality, how we frame reality, is very Western. Epistemology, the ways that we know and understand each other, are also very Western. Indigenous methodologies are not privileged. The ways in which Indigenous science has looked at ways of evidence, ways of collecting evidence, is not centered. And this has resulted in what Indigenous researchers call colonial knowledge systems. So in the previous slide, I showed all the ways that historical trauma and intergenerational trauma can pull a person. But it's also interesting to note the insidious way that our very knowledge systems have in fact become colonized as well. And a lot of these colonial knowledge systems that exist and persist today can very much be traced back to the missionary zeal under which the colonial projects took shape in United States history. There's always been a unique United States exceptionalism in which we did not identify as an imperialist colonizer. We were helping people. We were rescuing people. That missionary zeal, or as Mary Annette referred to it as the delusional zeal of Sister Catherine, this is something I'm doing to help you, but it's actually quite the opposite. One of the early Puritan emblems of this mindset is represented in the Massachusetts Bay Colony seal. Now, it's a bit strange because you can see the word cloud above the Indian figure is upside down. I'm not sure why that is. But this emblem shows a very drawn upon, tired, almost beaten down Indian man saying, "Come over and help us." The Academy and researchers have accomplished this very zeal in their missions to promote knowledge of Indigenous people. So, it was with these very intimidating facts that I embarked upon a research project in Bristol Bay, Alaska, to understand the ways in which colonization and historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, shaped some of the violence that women, Alaska Native women in that region, are experiencing today. And because I really wanted to get away from the traditional, and when I say traditional, the way that I was trained as a Western social scientist with a preoccupation of evidence-based practices, statistical modeling, being able to generalize from person to person, from community to community, I wanted to abandon all that I had learned and really tried to embrace a methodology that would privilege storytelling. As Marionette said at the very beginning of her presentation, the story is everything. And so for my study, what I did was I collected these stories over the course of 3 years from Yupik Eskimo women who had been victims or were survivors of rape, domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse. And there's a lot of resistance to doing this sort of project with Alaska Native women and engaging in storytelling conversations. Most of this criticism came, I think I can safely say it all came, from those that really didn't have an understanding or appreciation for storytelling and what this means to the Indigenous community. I was told that these stories would be too painful. In other words, survivors shouldn't discuss trauma unless they're doing it with an established, reputable, and licensed healthcare professional, whether it's a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a social worker. In other words, you can't rip the scab off if you're not trained to deal with the blowback. It was also argued that survivors would be too guarded. In other words, we know that victims of these types of crimes, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, are usually unlikely to report these, be it to the police, their friends, their family. So I was told that they're not going to tell these people what makes you think they'll just open up to you and tell you their stories. And finally, it was also argued that these stories would be too specific. Very personal stories, stories of survivorship. And the underlying concern was that you'll build a house of cards around this little select group of people you talk to, and you're not really going to get a full picture of what's going on because each person is so unique, their experiences are so unique. So what you're going to find isn't going to speak to a broad public. In other words, building a house of cards. So rather than going through all the reasons in which why I believe that this isn't the case, arguing with the quote-unquote Western perspective, I want to focus on the reasons why storytelling is an important part of the Indigenous-centered methodology. For one, there's already a rich history of this within the Native community and the Alaska Native community. Indigenous women have been telling their stories of survival for hundreds of years now. In fact, if you want an example, simply look to some of the documentation of Muscogee women during forced relocations. There's narratives dating back to 1883 where Native women are writing about some of these experiences with the early colonizers, the Army. So in fact, survivorship storytelling already has a 100-plus year history. And I always snicker somewhat when I hear that the rape reform movement in this country began in the 1970s. The rape reform movement was when we were telling survivors, come out with your story, talk about these issues, when in fact Native women have really been at the forefront of this movement for hundreds of years already. Stories are also an important tool of legal reform. There are documented instances of a single Native woman's story being able to influence wide degrees of social change and legal change within the tribal government. And finally, perhaps most importantly, and the whole purpose of this conference this year, is that stories have an amazing healing power for Alaska Native women. The fact that speaking and sharing produces feelings of empowerment, closure, and strength are some of the very issues that Carol Feller-Brady was talking about yesterday during our warming of the hands ceremony. So it was with these scripts, these indigenous scripts in mind, that I decided to undertake this study and speak with Yupik Eskimo women in Bristol Bay about their experiences with violence. And I was often asked, what does a Native woman, and I'm still asked this, what does a Native woman talk about when she talks about rape, when she talks about abuse, when she talks about recovery? And the reality is, she talks about everything. Without question, the issues that are brought up encapsulate everything, from historical trauma, to sovereignty issues, to colonialism, alcohol use. But instead of focusing exclusively on that, I draw your attention to a few things in this slide that show very important aspects of healing. So even though we have some of these big words, challenges, trauma, sovereignty issues, we also see other key issues popping up in this word cloud. Healing, grassroots mobilization, forgiveness. So when we really take a closer look, it's not just terminal narratives that are coming out in women's stories. Stories of strength and resilience are also popping out. And then I find, of course, when I look at this data time and time again, that there's a lot more that meets the eye when it comes to Native healing. This doesn't show up too great, but I always like to use the iceberg analogy. As I said earlier, we've seen the research on violence in Native communities, substance abuse in Native communities, depression, culture conflict, broken families, all focused on very terminal issues, very much quantifiable. We can count these things, we can take an inventory of these things in communities across the state. They're very much observable through Western methodologies. We've employed surveys, interviews, focus groups. But look at everything we're missing beneath the surface. If we begin chipping away at this iceberg and getting beneath the surface, we also find that Native women are discussing issues of colonial resistance, healing from trauma, community dialogues, and grassroots mobilization. As you can see, very much the opposite from the tip of the iceberg, right? Certainly a focus on resilience narratives, strengths-based narratives, issues that are not easily quantifiable, things that are not easily seen, at least not to the Western eye, but certainly observable when we start privileging indigenous methods of discovery. And so below the surface, we see that individual and family healing are happening in our Alaska Native communities. Grassroots social movements are building. Conversations are taking place. And perhaps most importantly, personal sovereignty, and to a degree political sovereignty, is also being exercised. So I'm just going to take you through a few quick snapshots of some of the data that I collected over the course of 3 years. I had mentioned to a number of people beforehand that I wasn't sure about including these snapshots of data because it puts out this implicit idea that by selecting quotes to present, says that these are the important ones and other stories that other women might have told are not important, and that is not what I wish to convey here today. But I thought it was important to let the survivors have a voice in this presentation. So I spoke earlier about this grassroots mobilization that occurs in some of these communities, as told by the women. One woman, Tina, runs a volunteer safety home in her village. As we know, villages are very spread out. Transportation to regional hubs is limited and often very expensive. So the villages in Bristol Bay do not have shelters. Access to the shelter can be very difficult. And so some survivors have instituted their own grassroots shelters in their villages. So Tina, as she says, she does it for family because when she has to bring her family into her home, for instance, when they're in danger or in crisis, when someone's drinking, she opens her home to them. And of course, we know that in villages, practically everyone is related to everyone else. So when she says that she opens her home to family, this really is a community structure that protects women. And Maddie mentions that the community is small, but the great thing about this small community is that every person can make a difference. And this is very much happening in the communities. There's also more community dialogue happening than meets the eye. Marionette mentioned that in Yupik communities, the colonial way was to stuff feelings down, not speak of anything. And I don't argue that this isn't true. Silence on sexual abuse and domestic violence certainly are problematic, but conversations are happening, discussions are building, people are speaking out, not just against their perpetrators, but having conversations on what it means to have healthy sexual relationships, what it means to have a healthy relationship in general. These conversations are happening. As Eva mentions, she's becoming more vocal since her victimization. As she says, and I'm sure it's no surprise to anyone, the more you talk about it, the less it's on your mind. Jenny mentions the same thing in her village, that she sees more conversation going on, and that she really equates this silence on sexual abuse to very traditional Yupik admonishments of silence. It was never the traditional Yupik custom to remain silent about bad things that were going on in your life. In fact, Yupik elders often advised against keeping silent because it could result in physical disease and pathology. And so Jenny mentions that she has begun inculcating those lessons to children in her village, warning them that if you hold these things in, you'll become sick as well. So we see in some ways that speaking out is not only a healing strategy, but we can also consider this a method of colonial resistance. And finally, I've also found that a lot of ways in which women heal is directly tied to cultural practices. One of the most important cultural practices that women in Bristol Bay talk about, Yupik women, is using the maquet, the steam bath. The steam bath was historically used as a public health function, a public health tool before the days of modern plumbing. It's basically like a sauna, only much, much hotter than the saunas that I'm used to. Very much hotter. If you guys want to hear a story about my first experience with the maquet, come up to me after this. But Tamara mentions that the maquet today has more than a cleansing function, that it's really a community compact where she's able to connect with other women in her community, have deep, meaningful conversations about culture, about health, about wellness, saying that this is really a time where we can go back to our spirituality, your time out time, when you're away from the world and back in your own culture. As Marionette said, one of the biggest problems with Western science and Western methodologies is that we can't measure these things. We can measure it by time spent in the steam bath? Probably not. These spirituality issues can't be captured. And finally, this is just another visual way of depicting methods of healing. And again, back to the issue of how do we quantify these things? We can't through Western methodologies. Beading, Yupik arts and crafts, subsistence, hanging fish, stripping fish, berry picking, time in the steam bath, all important mechanisms of healing for Yupik women. And I would imagine that in this community of Sitka and Southeast Alaska in general, there's ways in which Tlingit women heal that are very much tied to cultural practices. And these are the issues that need to be acknowledged and put forth if we're going to explore true healing. But more important than this, I focused on individual healing until now, but at the core of healing really exists at the community level and the broader structural and systems level. So as women talked about some of the problematic issues they see in their community, whether it be the relationship between corporations, tribes, villages, some of the problems going on with families, or even some of the issues with social service agencies, the police, child protective services, the courts, they all noted that this dysfunction that exists really needs to be tempered and resolved in order for their own healing to improve. As Ginny mentions, it takes a whole community to raise a child. As Nancy mentions, I can't heal them, you can't heal them, the chief can't heal them. Families need to look at themselves and do it for themselves. It has to start with the family. So when we look at some of these words, we see how important it is to frame healing not only as an individual effort, but a collective one as well. And perhaps most importantly, we have to remember that the site of intervention when we're considering healing should not be focused just on Alaska Native people alone. The broader structures and systems that have continued to oppress and marginalize Native people are in need of intervention as well. And as you can see by all these quotes, and I'm sure nobody's going to be surprised by this, when women talk about problems in their community, they're talking about problems about outsiders coming in, leaving immediately, being up against regional, state, and federal controls, whether we're talking about limited entry fishing, election of leadership in the corporations, whether we're talking about the ways in which Alaska's court system has interfered with the tribal court system, or on the flip side, or on the other end of the spectrum, simply not being able to exercise one's culture, having issues learning Yupik because the resources aren't available, or perhaps they're not transparent. These are all very important issues that are profound catalysts of healing for Alaska Native people. Indigenous scholar Brenda Hill refers to this imperative of a call for social change, not just social services. And it's really the broader structures and systems that are in need of intervention too, if we're going to promote healing, long-term healing, for Native women in Alaska.
Thank you, Jeremy and Mary Annette. We wanted to make sure to provide some time for a little bit of dialogue, and that's why we provided the length of time for the presentations. And so both Mary Annette and Jeremy are here if you want to have a little, if you have some questions of them, or if you have some comments, you're encouraged to have some dialogue. Did you want me to move the microphone down here? So, Pete.
I'm Peter Squire. I'm the chief judge of the Sitka Tribal Court, and And I would like to know what your thoughts are on what the tribal courts can do to try to help people move through this series of personal, sometimes very personal forms of trauma. Do you have any thoughts on those? So they'd be very helpful to me because I see a lot of things that are out there, and my whole purpose in life is pretty much to help people.
Yeah, certainly a good question, and definitely a complex one to unpack. One of the biggest issues that I have noticed when I engage in conversations about tribal courts or legal structures or justice delivery is that there is a lot of confusion, particularly in the state of Alaska, but California as well, about the authority of tribal courts to operate in Alaska. I'm sure we all know that Alaska is a public law 280 state, and with that comes a very complex, bizarre patchwork of laws and policies that aren't exactly transparent or clear to the Native community in terms of what they are able to do with tribal court. And as a result, I have noticed that, particularly in villages, there is a great deal of difficulty even getting tribal court off the ground. Tribal court has this very a very sad kind of stop and go momentum. It'll resurrect for a few years and then will stop. So I think in answer to your question, I think we have to change some of the broader systems and structures that have hindered tribal court in the first place. I think that Alaska Native villages, their rights need to be made much more clearer, because a lot of leaders and a lot of Native people think that tribal court isn't an option to them. And so I'm not sure if that answered your question, but when you brought up this issue, that was the first thing that it reminded me of, is that there is simply a lack of awareness of the possibilities and the options.
That's such a good question. I kind of process things slowly, but one of the things that I've noticed what I thought of immediately was, the issue of missing and murdered women, and I've written about that, and as with such complex jurisdictional issues among the public law 280 states and non-public law federal jurisdiction, it becomes very complicated. And one of the things I've seen, I've written about, especially like some communities like in the Plains states, the women are just generally are saying, really looking like, we have resources. We don't have a lot of money, but we have resources in the community. So I'm seeing a real, like, from the ground up, people like, I remember an instance of a young woman who was missing, and there was an area that they really wanted to search, and people, her family and community members felt that this might be where she was, and they went to it was like kind of a creek bottom, and there's something like 3 jurisdictions of law enforcement officers were standing around the top trying to sort out who should go down there. And her relatives came over on horses, and they said, well, we're going to go down there and look, and so you can't do that. And they said, well, heck with you, it's our res, we'll go down there if we want. And they just went down there, and they found her. And the way they organized themselves, and as one of the women advocates I was speaking, she said, we have phones. We have cars. They have, apparently there's like a little app you can get on your phone, it's like a walkie-talkie, and people have kind of just said, heck with that, we're just going to do it on the ground here. I think there's such a tendency to be top down, like, oh, we have to wait until the tribe tells us, what we should do. And, versus the young folks, I don't see the young folks, they're just kind of sick and tired of waiting around. They're just saying, heck with it, we're just going to go ahead. And that's really exciting to me. I'm seeing a lot of people throughout Indian country who are not just young folks, but then the older folks get excited too. So they're like, well, yeah, that's, we're really resourceful peoples. And that's how we've been able to stick around so long and just kind of revitalizing that. And so that's, I don't know if that's anything specific, but I think just a recognition of the real power that resources that we have, even though we don't have a whole lot of money to fund it.
Before I recognize you, Sergey, I do want us to have a little bit of discussion regarding the theme and regarding the 150-year sesquicentennial and what this means in terms of intergenerational trauma, historical trauma to Alaska Natives here, and the Alaska Day, the transition, the non-participation and involvement in what was claimed by the Russians and what was in the Treaty of Cession to the United States of America. And I think that kind of dialogue is really important because this is ground zero. This is where all the celebrations take place, if you will, on Alaska Day, because this is where the transition occurred. I once went up to Anchorage for Alaska Day. It wasn't for Alaska Day, but I happened to be there during Alaska Day, and I thought, boy, this is the biggest city in Alaska, and there is going to be all kinds of parades. I just can't imagine how big it's going to be here. Nothing. Everybody just took the day off and went fishing or whatever. But here in Sitka, there's parades, there's things that we've mentioned before. And I think we need to start talking about what kind of impact that has had on us as Alaska Natives, and even those who are not Alaska Native, to have that discussion. And it's probably going to take a series of discussions, perhaps over a period of years. But I'd like perhaps Marionette, if you would comment on that, and Jeremy. We have Sergey, we have Louise, and we have Harriet, and a gentleman in the back there. But I think, Louise, you have something specific that you can add to the discussion. But Marionette, if you would comment on that, and Jeremy, then we'll have Louise.
This is the first I've heard of Alaska Day in session, and I was like, oh my God, it seems like a real commemoration of colonialism, if you will. And it didn't seem like, and I read about it, and it didn't seem to be too much involvement of the local folks here, the Tlingit folks, and I thought, oh, I wonder what those folks think up there, how they feel about it. And so I'm really excited to be here for this, because I have a feeling, that there's this real boosterism going on, there in the community, and of course we're bringing money in and various things, and maybe there might be some differences of opinion about it, and I'm excited to hear about that. I want to write a story about it, so I'd like to visit with anybody that has any opinions.
May I ask a question? Okay. First of all, I want to compliment your presentation. As a clan leader, the transition has been so rapid at some point in time in our history, from colonialization, the different organizations. In your presentation, I think it'd be good to request a copy for the laymen, the religious groups, and also like our AMPNS organizations, because it would take a lot of time to adapt your presentation. And I think it will help our people recollect where our place is in a community, in the state, and overall understanding the federal government, the responsibility as Tlingits, how we can actually join a melting pot and understand by reading your presentation An example, the restricted deeds that our people actually are tied into, the original clan land, and where the city government or municipal government are trying to absorb the land to take it on me. And so, how do we actually communicate without being negative? And we know that our place with the federal government, Department of Interior, and Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, Clinton and Haida, there are people that have a lot of concerns, and how we can adapt in a proper way without being chastised, without being saying that we're negative, but just to be able to understand how we can work with the federal, state government. Another example is Public Law 280. And like we have tribal court now, how the villages can actually have equal responsibility in tribal court, because each village should be equal in all the tribal court activities. And in every community is not the same. And every community faces different responsibility. And I like the first question about the tribal court here in Sitka. And I think the visibility in Peter Squire standing up and saying visibility of tribal courts. And so it would be advantageous if we had hard copy to be able to look at it. And that comment to me, I'll stop, but I really appreciate the presentation. I want to thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I can certainly, I'm happy to make mine available, send it. But one of the things I did just want to say, regarding, coming, I don't know, just my opinion and doing this work, covering, being a journalist, covering Indian country for a number of years, and kind of what we see in this country. I think that you're going to be chastised if you do anything short of absolute sign-on to the boosterism of Alaska did. You just, I think you just will. It's, one hears the sentiment, oh, that's ancient history. Just get over it. And anybody that brings up anything other than maybe the economic benefits of any given celebration like this, I'm sure you will be some blowback, and you have to be prepared for that. So you can, I would think you have to be prepared to stand your ground. But yeah, I'm often shocked at how any kind of mention of anything that is not part of whatever narrative is going on, and how easily people take offense. And when I think, when we look at what's going on currently politically, and this whole group of people who are far more angry than I had realized, people feel wrongly accused. That's my opinion. I think that people feel wrongly accused and they're angry. It's not my fault. I didn't do that. Those are my ancestors. You guys just need to move forward. Not, just in this inability for people to take themselves out of themselves a little bit. So I think, anything short of absolute support, you are going to probably just, you have to be prepared for that. But, you're going to have to be strong and really think about, pretty carefully about how you're going to bring it forward and how you're going to stay with it, if that's what you want to do.
Okay, Sergey, then we'll have Louise. Sergey.
I speak carefully because I'm not Indian, but I've been with this community for 40 years. Done research on the history of Russian colonialism, but also on the Russian church, which is very much part of this culture as well. And now writing a book on the Creoles, who are people of mixed Russian and native descent, mostly Alutiiq and Tlingit. And I just want to make a cautionary observation, and this is addressing Marion. And I've learned that from the elders. When they came here, a lot of the elders were still here. And they often made an observation. They said the politics of Lower 48 and the politics of Southeast Alaska are different. We do not, the radical politics of the 48 is not how we approach things. And I think this kind of, and you yourself said that you don't know anything about Alaska Day or Southeast Alaska politics. So I would be careful before I jump at conclusions how things should be done here. And I'm not suggesting anything, but keeping in mind that my understanding of Sitka is there are a lot of people who have Russian ancestry. It's complicated. And also I know that, and Jerry knows this, there's been a lot of work has been done. This is not a reservation. A lot of people are native and non-native people married to each other. A lot of work has gone into keeping peace between the native and non-native community. And I personally also think there are a lot of problems with Alaska Day, believe me. But just to kind of say, let's abolish Alaska Day, let's just throw all this stuff, I think it would cause problems. I mean, that's my personal opinion. And I'll give you just one example. I just watched a fiesta in Santa Fe where there's a Hispanic celebration, and it's mostly their cultural and ethnic celebration, but they have an element there that's offensive to Pueblos. And there was a counter demonstration of young Pueblos, very angry, very radical. And then the elders, the leaders of the Pueblo communities, the governors, and they have their own government structure. They said to me, and I talked to them, they said, the young people have good ideas, but what they're doing is not the Pueblo way. We don't yell and we don't shout. We work directly with the political system. They were very angry at their own young radicals. So I'm just explaining kind of the way I understand it. I may be wrong, but as a friend, I'm just doing this.
Oh, yeah, I appreciate that you are wrong. So guys, just wanted to say real quick before Marionette responds to you. Nobody's saying abolish Alaska Day. We're saying there's historical trauma, intergenerational trauma. Let's talk about it. Let's work it out. Marionette.
I think in all due respect, sir, I think that's actually a perfect example, I think, of a kind of reactionary response to this kind of discussion. I've been here now, I was here during the beginning of all of this talk. I don't, unless I had a momentary period where I wasn't paying attention, I don't recall a single even allusion to the idea of abolishing Alaska Day. Did anybody say anything about that? Nothing of anything remotely approaching that. And this man immediately leads to the very fact that maybe we're thinking about discussing the inclusion of some other people's experience. And that was, I think that's all, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I misheard things, but I think that was what people were saying. There was no criticism that Alaska Day is in any way wrong. The celebrations are correct. There was just, there was a couple of statements that perhaps we might want to include some other opinions. And so then this man immediately jumps to that. So it's this very reactionary, attitude. So see, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get this man's, this kind of knee-jerk reaction. So yeah, you got to be prepared. So to me, that's just so far out in left field that make that statement. I'm just constantly, people are such interesting creatures, aren't we? The way we respond to things, how we get in this defensive mode when I haven't heard a single note of offense, but yet, wow, I guess we're kind of fearful creatures, huh? So I kind of love us people, us human beings,
I wanted to mention, well, actually I wanted to turn it over to Louise and Vic. They actually had a really interesting experience at the school yesterday, and it kind of shows the ways in which we might be making some form of measurable progress. Yeah, Vicki, don't you remember?
Oh.
Yeah, okay, like, you know, with Rowan playing the reporter and now the Tlingit perspective is being considered, will you guys talk about that? Or Louise, do you want to?
While we're having Louise and Vicki come up, Vicki was adopted by Isabella Brady, who is Louise's mom, as she had mentioned before, so they are both from the Kixetti Point House in here in Sitka. Louise has decades of experience in working with historical intergenerational trauma, and so does my wife, Vicki Miko. Please give a welcome to Louise and Vicki.
My second name is Yagi Talbot-Gay, and I would like to say much cheese to our two presenters. Welcome to welcome, and thank you for the information. I think this has okay. I'm really excited that this is a topic, and I think it really, the healing. Just personally, I think that so many of the traumas, I've heard the phrase pathology porn thrown around in Native circles lately, and it's about how, you know, the press and different people like to talk about the sexual abuse, the domestic violence, the alcoholism, the addiction in the Native community. And I'm a product of that. I am a survivor of both domestic violence and sexual assault. And the reason I guess I felt like I needed to disclose this is because I think, as was mentioned, as long as we're not talking about it, we're not going to heal. And I also believe that part of what Alaska Day does and part of what the federal government does and the state government and the assimilation does is make us believe that we can't deal with our own issues, our own problems, that we don't have it within us to talk about these issues and to hold people accountable for their behavior in our own communities. And I really believe that this Clan conference, and I believe that having the Clan leaders here for this is very important. And I would like to challenge not only the Clan leaders, but all of the people in this room to really start reaching out and listening to the people who are struggling. Because I remember it was in 1986, I went to the first Southeast Alaska Native Women's Conference. And up until the time I was in my 30s, I believed that being an alcoholic, being an addict, being a woman being a Native woman was a deficit. That it was the reason that I was a victim. And it was a reason that I was having all kinds of problems. And I even had an anthropologist ask me in the late 80s, so what does it mean to be Tlingit? I said, well, you know, we have a really high domestic violence rate. And he's like, no, what does it mean to be Tlingit? I said, well, you know, we have a lot of alcoholism. He's like, no, really, what does it mean though? And it wasn't until I went to that first Southeast Alaska Native Women's Conference that I heard a number of elder women speak and talk to knowing who we are, knowing who I am as Kixetti, knowing who I am as Tlingit, and being able to be a part of this community. I saw the strength. I saw the strength. And that was the beginning of turning around and seeing that actually what my identity as a Tlingit, as a Kixetti woman, it doesn't make me a victim, it makes me a survivor, and it makes me proud of who I am. And it makes me see so much value in who we are that we don't need outsiders to come and tell us how we're going to heal. We just need to start talking to each other. We need to start listening to each other. And so there's a lot of wisdom in these rooms. And I really, really have always appreciated how I feel like I have been accepted with open arms by many of the elders. And, remember Mark Jacobs Jr. and Adelaide and so many when my father died. The way that people started stepping up. I lost my father, but there were all of these other uncles that came in to provide that love and that guidance. And this is the key. This is really what I believe the key is. We're the ones that strengthen these relationships. That's what last night was about. That's what all of this is about. And I think as we get to know ourselves, we can be stronger and say, you know what, this Alaska Day was an interruption. We've been interrupted by the Russians, we've been interrupted by the United States, but you know what, we're still here as us. So I guess, and I just feel like, my mother was like, here, like, get up, stand up, say something. And I always listen to her, so. So, Guru Chish, for your attention, Guru Chish, for being here. Thank you for bringing this topic forward, because I really believe it's like, in every Western study that's been done since the 1970s is that the answer lies within us. And so, let's not wait for the grant. Let's not wait for the blessing of the state court or the Supreme Court. Let's just do it. Guru Chish.
Did anybody see the movie Girl Interrupted? When Louise was speaking, the phrase that came to mind is "Clinket interrupted." Thank you, Louise, for speaking from your heart and your skill, your knowledge, and your experience. That's the kind of dialogue that we really need to have. Let's see, I think there are some hands over here. I know Jackie, oh, you moved over here. So go ahead.
Yeah.
Jacqueline.
So, I guess what I wanted to say is that Sergei Khan is absolutely right that Alaska Day is a symbol of colonialism, and all of us are colonized people. I mean, especially if you leave the United States, people look at us and they see American. And if we go to the lower 48, people in the Seattle airport might recognize us as Alaskan. I think we're all kind of distinct. But our relationship with the colonizers is very intimate. And taking away, trying to remove that is, as he said, very complex. And something that I want to recommend is AA. And the reason I bring it up is because the whole format, the other thing all of us, not all of us, many of us probably have is an intimate relationship or some kind of a relationship with somebody who's abused alcohol. And I think alcohol is it's a scourge on our people. And if you go to AA, the format, it's a process. What you are asked to do is share your own experience. And, people have alluded to this several times, that talking and storytelling and sharing your own experience is a very strong avenue for strength and healing. So I just wanted to toss that idea out there. And, I know it's hard if you live in a small community, but it's something I've used throughout my adult life, and I've found it to be very helpful.
Jacqueline announced that she just retired, so she's available for any kind of interviews, discussion, and counseling then. Thank you, Jacqueline, for your comments. This is a comment back there. Oh, Harry, yeah. Lady, ladies and coordinator. Thank you, Harry.
Yeah, I appreciate the presentation today, and glad, I was very happy that he went up to Bristol Bay, and I was just wondering how he got the women to talk. Because, you know, those kind of experiences happening to you when you're little and, or even when you're older, and kind of topic you had on sexual assault and everything, it's really hard for anybody to, you know, to talk. And I was wondering too about, you know, did you do it in talking circles or something like that?
Yeah, so, you know, I've been asked this question every single time I talk about this, and, you know, I could talk about this in so many different ways, but really what it boils down to is I was lucky, because I had these, you know, I had the exact same concerns that many had, you know, that issues of gender, race, culture, geography, you know, there's too much discongruity that, that, you know, this sort of arrangement, you know, me talking with a Native survivor of violence just couldn't happen. But what I did was, like I said, this was, I wanted to prioritize storytelling, so I didn't do talking circles, though I certainly respect talking circles. I think they're a wonderful way to prioritize Indigenous knowledge systems. But what I did was, it was very similar to, well, to the Western eye. It's very similar to an unstructured interview. You know, I would sit alone at the shelter in Dillingham with a survivor who was interested in telling her story. And, you know, we kind of laid out all the facts ahead of time. You know, they were told that, you know, this is a researcher from California. He has no connections to this community. He has no connections to the corporation, no connections to the tribe. He's not enmeshed in tribal politics. And for a remote community such as that, and in the villages certainly, that anonymity was profoundly important to women. That was really their first concern is, you know, I'll share my story, but first, where is it going to go? Who's going to know? Because I had considered doing, working with a team of interviewers, local interviewers, Native women in Bristol Bay, and the shelter quickly told me, that's probably not going to pan out the way you think it will. You know, the relationships between a lot of the families here are very tense, and you know, if you include a team of interviewers, you'll alienate potentially 75% of the community. So I structured it as a one-on-one dialogue. Did that answer your question? Did you want to?
Yeah, the other thing I kind of wanted to share with everyone, my daughter, Paulette Marino, was a sisterhood president here for a couple years, and Andy Roberts, they went up to Castle Hill at Alaska Day, and they had their signs about the Plinkets and, you know, the first people of the land and this and that. I was down in the crowd celebration, and then she got up there, she had her signs and things about us being the very first people of this land and all that. And then she asked to have some time to talk to up there, and they completely ignored her, and then they didn't want her up there, and they didn't want her to be saying things. So they asked her not to, you know. And don't, in my own personal feelings is, I don't feel like celebrating Alaska Day, you know, the way they treated my daughter that time. And she was very hurt by how they were treating her. And I don't know who sits in on the Alaska Day celebration, but I just wanted to say that sometimes they can be cruel and they can be insensitive. And they don't recognize sometimes the Plinkett culture, this and that. So I was very angry.
Karen, when you talk about marginalization, that's a key subject that I'm interested in because I see marginalization in Native Americans in movies, and TV, and in the news media, reporting, and those who are reporters. You're talking about marginalization in terms of methodologies and processes, Western methodologies and processes.
Yeah, so, you know, like everything, it's certainly very complex. But I think the ways in which Western methodologies have continued to marginalize and oppress Native people is that it has not. Western methodologies, they don't promote Native autonomy. I think it's best for me to give you a really poignant example of this. I recently submitted an article for publication in the Journal of Violence Against Women, and in that article, I discussed the ways in which the silence, the culture of silence surrounding sexual abuse among Yupik Eskimo women is directly linked to the legacies of colonialism. So I focused on how boarding school experiences, experiences with Western forms of social control and justice delivery, how all of these things are connected to the decision to speak out or not. And what was the point of this story? Oh yeah, so when I received editorial reviews on this article from 2 reviewers, experts in the field, it was very clear that these were not Indigenous reviewers. And the reason being is they said, you know, you have great quotes, you know, you've certainly spoken to a number of Native women, they're certainly saying important things, but you need to pare down some of these quotes. You need to do some trimming. You need to really discard some of the irrelevant stuff and really focus on the most important piece of what they're saying. Sounds a lot like assimilation and language loss and stripping Indigenous people of their language, doesn't it? Only it's being done in a very academic, kind of stealthy manner. And so, you know, I wanted this piece to get published, so I'm left with this decision, what do I do? How do I, you know, accommodate this? And so I went back to the community, I didn't go back to the community, but I emailed the shelter, lots of Native leadership at the shelter, and I said, I've got this problem, you know, they want me to cut these quotes, they want me to trim them down, what do I do? And the director of the shelter, a good friend of mine, she's like, well, first of all, these aren't quotes, this isn't data, you know, these stories are women's intellectual property, and that needs to be respected. So I simply conveyed that message to this reviewer. Haven't heard back yet, don't know where that stands right now. But I think that's one example of how Western methodologies have continued to marginalize and oppress Native people. And you know, and it's you know, it sounds very innocuous, you know, at first reading, first glance, but when we're trimming down things that people are saying to fit our, as in Western society's views of how knowledge should be imparted, it really starts to open up some serious questions about how much our science is helping the Native community. Where'd Jerry go? I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be moderating or not.
Hi. My name is Patricia Alexander, and I'm a member of the Sitka Historical Society and Museum. And one thing that I have noticed, academics and people associated with museums, is that when a quote is made from an academician, it is readily accepted as the gospel truth. And when a quote is taken from oral history of an indigenous person, they write it lacks academic credibility. You know, it doesn't get more blatant than that.
And I think that's something that we need to work through, and museums need to open their doors to Indigenous people so that they can tell the other side of the truth, and that it can be in the museums for everyone to see. Thank you.
Yeah, and I definitely wanted to build on that. What you just said is the exact reason I shy away from announcing myself as an expert or a scholarly voice or whatever on these issues, because I completely agree with you. The Indigenous people are the experts of their own lives and their own communities. So, yeah, that's the exact reason I shied away from saying that I'm an expert and positioning myself and other academics as the voice of how things are and how things should be.